Hello, my name is Katrina Newkirk-Brown. I am a graduate student at Morningside College. I am a sixth grade literacy teacher at Prairie Creek Intermediate School, which is within the College Community School District. And the title of my research project is The Effect of Introducing Vocabulary Before Read Aloud on Vocabulary Knowledge in sixth grade students. So the problem that I wanted to address through my research is that in the 2015 National Assessment of Educational Progress, there were low levels of proficient scores in reading comprehension. Specifically, fourth grade students, only 36% were considered proficient, and eighth grade students, only 34% were considered proficient. As a literacy teacher, my goal is for all students to be proficient in reading comprehension. Past research about reading comprehension and vocabulary shows that there is a strong correlation between reading comprehension and vocabulary scores. So students that score higher in vocabulary also scored well in reading comprehension. Vocabulary has been shown to be a strong predictor of comprehension. It's unknown for sure why this is, but there are several hypotheses. One is that there's a causal relationship between vocabulary and reading comprehension. Another is that general knowledge supports both vocabulary and reading comprehension. And the other is the idea that the relationship between vocabulary and reading comprehension is reciprocal, with each supporting the other. Students need to combine their knowledge of individual words and the way that they're used in passages, which may be another reason why vocabulary and reading comprehension are so closely linked. This is true, the comprehension scores and vocabulary scores correlating across all grade levels. Quality vocabulary instruction, according to Beck, is actually rarely done. It's often assumed that students will just learn vocabulary independently, and so they are given short exercises, often closed passages or looking up dictionary definitions, or they're given short passages or worksheets from Basel series in order to learn vocabulary. However, best practice is using a whole group common text so that students are able to make connections to the words. Students should be able to look at student-friendly definitions. They should have multiple exposures to the words, so looking at it more than once. They should have opportunities to use those words in writing, and the nuances of words should also be discussed with students so they can understand how they may be used in different situations. When looking at vocabulary instruction, it's also important to think about what words you're going to take the time to teach. Words that are being taught should be words that are important to the text. They should be words that students will encounter on their own reading. Beck describes a multi-tiered system. Tier 1 words are words that are used every day in our spoken language. Tier 2 words are words that are actually found more often in written language and are important to understanding the text. Tier 3 words would be considered subject or content specific, such as words that would be specifically found in science or math classes. When looking at vocabulary, it's also important to look at the effect and the connection between vocabulary and read aloud. In the elementary, vocabulary is often chosen from a whole group text. However, doing this significantly drops after fourth grade. Read aloud has been shown to promote reading comprehension and vocabulary in elementary classrooms, but this is rarely used in middle school, often due to time constraints. Research does show that there is a strong connection between read aloud and vocabulary. A study done by Baker, Santoro, Chard, Fine, Park, and Osterstedt in an elementary classrooms of first grade students over 19 weeks in 12 schools showed a significant effect in narrative retell and vocabulary outcomes, with a Cohen's effect of D equals 1.02. Another synthesis was done by Swanson et al., and it looked at 18 different studies. When those 18 different studies were looked at and an analysis done, read aloud was shown to have positive outcomes on vocabulary and reading comprehension. With vocabulary, there was a mean effect size of 1.02. In comprehension, there was a mean effect size of 0.70. Although there has been significant done looking at the benefits of read aloud and vocabulary in elementary students, the effect of read aloud on middle school students or sixth grade students is rarely addressed. The goal of my research project was to measure the impact of introducing vocabulary to students before read aloud on vocabulary knowledge. The tool that I was using to measure this is the vocabulary knowledge scale. My hypothesis was that students introduced to vocabulary before read aloud would make greater gains on the vocabulary knowledge scale. The variables within my study were the independent variable, which is when students are introduced to vocabulary, and the dependent variable was student growth and vocabulary knowledge. The possible impact would be to help teachers make instructional decisions about the use of read aloud in middle school, also to be able to make decisions about whether or not to connect vocabulary to class text, and then personally looking at should I connect my vocabulary to read aloud or should it be taught independently to my students. The participants in my study were my two sixth grade classes. My morning group of students was my experimental group. They were composed of 29 students. 9 of those students had IEPs. Because these students were only in the classroom for half of the class, the rest of the time they were pulled out for small group instruction, they did not receive the full intervention, and so their data was not included in the statistical analysis. Of the 20 students that were left that were included in my statistical analysis, 8 of those students were considered academically at risk. My afternoon section was my control group, and it was composed of 24 students. 1 student had an IEP, and 1 student had a 504 plan. 4 of the students in my control group were considered academically at risk. The materials used for this study included our read aloud text, which was the novel The Crossover by Kwame Alexander. From this text, we chose a list of Tier 2 vocabulary words to specifically instruct students about. Some sample words from that text included sibling, verify, solemn, profusely, and quiver. And in this case, we weren't talking about a quiver of arrows, but quiver as in shaking. The materials for this included the vocabulary knowledge scale pre-test and post-test. On this, students self-reported their knowledge of vocabulary. So students were given the pre-test, and the pre-test and post-test looked exactly the same. And before reading, students had to mark their current level of knowledge on the words. They marked one of the following levels. If they marked a level 1, it was that they had never seen or heard that word. A level 2 word is a word that students had seen or heard, but they did not know what it meant. A level 3 word is they know what the word means, and it's maybe, and they could give a definition. A level 4 word is they are an expert at using that word, and they could use it correctly in a sentence. If the students were marking themselves at a level 3 or 4, they were required to show that knowledge. So to get full credit for a level 4 word, students needed to use that word appropriately, grammatically in a sentence that showed meaning. Materials also included the teacher-created vocabulary sheets and the extended practice opportunities. So one example of a vocabulary sheet, right here, looked like this. And as discussed in the procedure following, students would have a copy of this that they would keep. And all students, after reading, we would go through and discuss the student-friendly definitions and the way it was used in the story and the part of speech. Students also were given extended practice opportunities, which will also be discussed. Extended practice opportunities included things like vocabulary writing such as this, in which students had to write a story using a minimum of 5 vocabulary words from the word wall, and students were given a fun picture that they were able to write a story about using those vocabulary words. The procedure is both the control and the experimental groups were given the pre-test, and these results form my baseline scores. The experimental group, when I would follow the procedure, were actually given the vocabulary sheet at the very beginning of the week, and all of the words were previewed. Every day we previewed any words that I knew were going to be in the reading that day, and then students were instructed to watch for that word while we were reading. When the word was read as a part of the text, we would stop and discuss as a class. We would talk about what did we think the word possibly meant? How was the word being used within the context of the story? And did it remind us of any other words that we already knew that we could use to help us figure out what it meant? After reading, we would go back to the vocabulary sheet and we would fill in any words and any blanks that we had used that day. The intervention group did not get any preview or dirt before reading or any mini lessons during reading. After read aloud, we would simply take out the vocabulary sheet. I would point out to students which words were used in that day's readings, and then we would complete the answers and blanks on the worksheet. After that, all the work for the groups were similar. All groups were given practice opportunities that included vocabulary poems, vocabulary drawings, vocabulary writings, and using Quizlet.com for online practice. At the conclusion of the novel, I administered the post-test using the vocabulary knowledge scale to measure growth. Data was analyzed at the end of a 7-week intervention. Looking at my results, although the experimental group did make great gains, it was not enough evidence to be considered statistically significant in when vocabulary is introduced to students. So I accepted the null hypothesis. This table shows my pretest and post-test scores. Group 1 is my experimental group and Group 2 is my control group. The mean scores on the pretest were actually fairly close. However, the standard of deviation in my experimental group was very high. On the post-test, the experimental group had a higher overall mean score, and the standard deviation on both groups was actually fairly similar. The effect size on the post-test was actually a moderate effect in which Cohen's D was 0.363 on the experimental group. There are several implications that need to be discussed when looking at this research. This reinforced the connection between reinforced the importance of connecting vocabulary to a whole group text. Beck notes that it is important for students to make that connection to vocabulary so they're able to connect it back to the text when looking at understanding. Middle school teachers may begin to see read aloud as beneficial based on the results of this research and may consider connecting their vocabulary to read aloud versus teaching it in isolation. While there was only a moderate effect overall on the intervention group, academically at-risk students in particular benefited from this intervention. This graph shows the mean difference scores in the 5 lowest academic students from each group. And if you notice, the light bar right here, which is my intervention group, actually made more growth than the 5 lowest academically achieving students in my control group. There were also other limitations of the timing and length of the study. So the pretest was administered after the class had actually started the novel, so there was a change in procedure for students. In addition, this study was only 7 weeks long. The academic makeup of students in the groups would also be considered a limitation. The control and intervention groups were made up of students that were not considered academically equivalent. Finally, student self-reporting on the vocabulary knowledge scale was also another limitation. Because students were self-reporting, they may not report their true knowledge. Because higher levels of knowledge required more work and more writing, it was possible that students may have underreported their knowledge just to be done sooner. In the future, looking at future research, it would be important to, when conducting a similar study, to make sure to conduct the study over a longer time. Data collection should be done at the beginning of the novel, so the pretest should be done before the novel starts, and data should be could also possibly collected over several novels to get even more information. In addition, it may also be considered to implement this in a subject-specific classroom, such as math or science. Also, looking at future research, it would be important to use experimental and control groups that were more academically equivalent. Because this method was shown to be beneficial for at-risk academic students, it would be possible to also look at conducting a study with including students with IEPs, but making sure that they're in the classroom for the entire intervention so that their information could be included in the statistical analysis. Also, another thing that would be important to do is to look at streamlining the pre-test and post-test administration. Some ideas may be looking at multiple choice options or possibly even a digital version. In conclusion, further research